incorporate decades of Israeli occupation of Palestinian land in the global climate justice conversation. I'm Annalise Borges, and this is The Stream.
So what does the genocide in Palestine have to do with climate justice? Well, everything.
Since the beginning of this war, the Israeli military has emitted 1.92 million tons of CO2. That's equivalent to a commercial airline flying back and forth between New York and London over 3 million times. And
as a climate justice movement, we have to listen to the voices of those who are being oppressed and those who are fighting for freedom and for justice.
Long live Palestine, long live Gaza. The government supports the people of the UK didn't. Zionism's not compatible with
281,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. That is how much the first 2 months of Israel's war on Gaza have generated, according to a study published by UK and US researchers, who also point out that that is more than the annual carbon footprint of 20 of the world's most climate vulnerable nations. How do you bring about a conversation about the environment in the midst of a brutal war that has killed more than 26,000 people? Well, that is what our guests today are here to help us answer. Rania Harrara is a Palestinian environmentalist and human rights defender, founder of the Young Arab Feminists Coalition. Mikaela Loach is an author and climate justice activist, and Celine, the co-founder of Slow Factory Foundation, an organization working at the intersection of human rights and environmental justice. Thank you all so much for joining us here on the stream for this very important conversation. Rania, when we talk about Gaza, we're talking about this brutal war. Why, in your opinion, is still important to talk about climate justice in the midst of this war?
I think as environmental defenders, we must center human life at the core of our advocacy. We cannot be claiming to advocate for land and protect land when we have indigenous communities in the Semaan region who is facing a genocide. It's our duty as not only environmental defenders, but also as humans to defend human rights defenders and to defend environmental defenders in Palestine. And for those who fail kind of to humanize Palestinian, I want them to know that the occupation, that the use of chemical weapon not only is increasing the level of CO2, it's increasing deforestation. People don't have access to water, and the water that is accessible is polluted and causing the death of thousands of Palestinians. And I think something else that not a lot of people cover is the impact of the occupation on people residing in the West Bank.
Absolutely.
Palestinian farmers.
So sorry to interrupt you, Rania. We will absolutely get to that point. I just want to start with this particular war and the impact it's having. Celine, I just wanted your thoughts here because I saw you know.
The climate justice movement is looking at Gaza as a case study, not only for what's happening in terms of climate, but also, as you mentioned, in human rights. We see that Palestine is one of the most egregious examples of abuses of human rights and environmental injustices perpetuated by the most powerful global forces of militarization and wars for resources and extraction. And Palestine and Gaza specifically as an issue is one of the most contested issue. It's a litmus test, if you will, when in the climate justice movement, in the human rights movement, Palestine is holding as a case study a sort of compounding issues that we're looking at, where, as you mentioned, water, we're talking about food, we're talking about access to hygiene, simple hygiene, the rise of diseases is also part of a climate injustice that they are experiencing.
Mikaela, various climate groups have marched in solidarity with Palestine, and especially in this context of the war in Gaza. Can you give us your take here?
I think it's been hopeful to see people finally making the connections between lots of different struggles that exist in the world. And I think that it's important that we understand that the climate crisis arose from ideologies of dehumanization and hierarchy and like dispossession of land, in particular, like from colonialism in the past and settler colonialism in the present. That is how the climate crisis kind of arose. It's this idea that, you know, some people's lives are more valuable than others, therefore some people's lives can be protected more than others, and that capital and that kind of the production of money for a very small amount of people is more important than the lives of the majority. Like, that's the kind of source of this climate crisis. And that's also the source of many wars that are existing at the moment, in particular this what's happening in Gaza at the moment. And so I think it's been really hopeful to see how the climate movement, not as a whole, there's been, I mean, the climate movement could be doing a lot better, but how a lot of groups have realized that none of us are free until all of us are free. And that actually through climate justice, we have an opportunity to actually create a better, liberated and transformed world. But that for us to do that, we cannot decide to make anyone disposable or to leave anyone behind. And that instead we have to actually fight in other struggles as well and act in really like active solidarity, which means realizing that we have to fight with our siblings that are being oppressed wherever they are in the world.
One of our friends here at the stream, climate activist Disha Ravi, had this to say about the connection between the two. I think it's important to measure the impact of war on climate, but I don't think it should be used as a tool to convince climate activists to care about genocide, colonization, ethnic cleansing. If you're not fighting for liberation from these, you're not fighting for climate justice. Rania, that is precisely what you were saying, right? This is a crisis that started much before, much earlier than October 7th. It started, many would say, 75 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I just believe that it's very sad to see that we have to show to people that the land is getting destroyed instead of centering that people on this land are dying, people on this land are getting killed. And I think it's very important for us as environmentalists, but also as humans, to acknowledge the fact that we should center Palestinians, we should center human life in our fight.
And again, we're talking about an occupation that has literally changed the landscape of this region. Take a look.
If you're a diaspora Jew, chances are you've received a gift at your bar bat mitzvah or at your wedding saying that a tree was planted in your name in the state of Israel. And of course, these trees aren't randomly planted. They're strategically planted to literally bury any trace of Palestinian heritage. One of the Zionist missions is to create the illusion that Jews have unequivocal right to the land. So they've spent the past 75 years systematically erasing every trace of Palestinian existence. They renamed Palestinian towns and roads to give them Hebrew names. They began bulldozing Palestinian homes to build Jewish settlements, and they began planting trees.
Mikaela, the Jewish National Fund has planted over 240 million trees across the region there. In your work, you have written and touched on themes of eco-fascism, greenwashing, and white environmentalism. Can you briefly tell us how this relates to Israeli occupation?
Yes, so it's not just that these kind of tree planting programs that displace people from their lands happen. It's not just that they happen in Palestine. It's also on the African continent. In Kenya, for example, indigenous communities were displaced from their land to offset kind of EU emissions. People call it carbon colonialism or climate colonialism, in the sense that to kind of greenwash, in the sense of, in the case of Israel, settler colonialism, this idea of, oh, we're doing it for the climate, we're doing it to better our planet through tree planting programs or other things. It's this idea of ecofascism, which basically marries white supremacy and environmentalism together, and says that, oh, we're doing these things, we're restricting people's liberty, we're restricting people's freedoms, we're causing harm to, in particular, indigenous communities, but it's for the planet, it's for a good reason. And it's a way that very oppressive regimes are able to kind of make themselves look better to the rest of the world. And I think it's something that we need to be really, really aware of, because just because someone says they care about the climate crisis does not mean that they care about human rights, does not mean that they care about liberation for all people. And it's really important that we are able to discern the difference between greenwashing, where you're basically just trying to make this same world but green, and climate justice, which is fighting for liberation for all of us, and a world where there's space for all of us and everyone gets to live in dignity. And those are two very different things, and we need to be able to discern that. We need to be able to call it out when it's happening.
And Rania, we talked about this, and you actually mentioned you believe this should have been taken into consideration by the ICJ and in the case of genocide brought by South Africa?
Yeah, so I know that in Europe, the European Union kind of criminalizes ecocide as crimes for the environment. And I know there's a lot of collectives that are working to criminalize ecocide, but I think this was the perfect opportunity to bring the environmental space and environmental aspect to the occupation, because they're not only genociding people, but also making it impossible for the next generations to live in Gaza. They're making it impossible for Palestinian heritage and Palestinian life to keep being there. So I truly think it's very important that as environmentalists, and that's something that the Climate Alliance for Palestine is working on right now, is to work on a huge Stopping Ecocide in Palestine campaign and trying to hold Israel accountable for their crimes against not only life, but also the land.
Celine, I see you nodding. You agree?
Absolutely. I think that green colonialism is extremely dangerous, not only because it is stealing land in order to plant foreign trees, like what we're seeing here in Israel and in occupied Palestine, but it's also dangerous because it is one of the main causes for forest fires. Because of these monocrops, the environment is not suited to sustain these monocrops in the first place. So first and foremost, green colonialism not only hurts the people, it also hurts the planet, and it doesn't last. It's not sustainable in and of itself. And the question on climate seems so unimportant next to the human rights violations and the sheer amounts of men, women, children, and the elderly injured and killed. But the climate issues here are central to Free Palestine and the Free Palestinian movement, not only because Israel has hit Gaza with the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs the size of Hiroshima, which is twice the amount of pounds of bombs that it had dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, sorry. But it's also a war for resources. I mean, Gaza holds a lot of resources underneath its soil. We're talking about gas, talking about oil. And so this is not just hurting the region and hurting the livelihood of these people. It's also done for a climate access to resources.
Absolutely.
And resources that
we're
really damaging.
We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but we're going to start with something very, very concrete for people who perhaps are unfamiliar with just how difficult it is to simply exist in that region if you're a Palestinian. Israel's occupation has a multitude of implications, notably on how Palestinians administer their resources. Have a look.
Did you know that it's illegal for Palestinians to collect rainwater for domestic or agricultural reasons? Because that rainwater, water that's literally falling from the sky, is the property of Israeli authorities. Water that is falling from the sky onto their own land, onto the Palestinians' land that was theirs first. It's illegal for them to have that.
Rania, this is very concrete for people to understand. You can't even collect rainwater.
Yeah, and I was thinking that this completely shows to us that Israel is not only bombing and restricting life in Gaza, but also in the occupied territories. At this moment, normally families gather in Palestine to collect olives from the olive trees, and that's something a lot of people in the West Bank cannot be doing right now because of the occupation. It's very complicated to have access to a permit to access your land and your olive trees. And a lot of young men and women are assassinated while they are trying to have access to their trees. And besides the trees, access to water is completely done to not allow agriculture workers to be able to sustain themselves and protect their heritage.
Mikaela, is that something that activists are aware and fighting for within these climate movements?
I think the climate movement has made some changes in recent years, and it continues to make changes. But I think there needs to be this understanding. I think a lot of people, especially if I'm talking about the Global North climate movement, understand that they feel like they're fighting against this existential threat of the climate crisis. But it feels like to a lot of people this existential threat that's coming in the future. And I think that what's so important is for the climate movement generally, but also all of us, to recognise that so many communities today are facing existential threats. And I think that what's happening in Gaza at the moment, the genocide, is showing there is an existential threat to people's lives today, to entire peoples. And there are also existential threats to indigenous communities across the world. These existential threats are not things of the future, they're things of the present. And if, as a climate movement, we can't come together to stop existential threats today, how on earth do we think that we could stop an existential threat in the future or far off? And so I think we need to recognise that not only do we need to come together in solidarity today, but also that there is so much that we can learn from peoples who have fought and are fighting existential threats today, and that to include that in our struggle only makes it stronger, and it doesn't make it weaker or dilute it. And it's just important that we do that.
Very important point. Celine mentioned the lucrative businesses that can also be part of this. We found, while we're doing a research for this show, another clip from social media. Take a look.
During a war and genocide, the Israeli government gave licenses to the world's leading gas companies to explore gas off of the coast of Gaza. This includes a British multinational gas and oil firm and an Italian energy giant. The Israeli energy minister said that these investments were said to strengthen Israel's energy security, lower the cost of living, and provide energy to support the transition to greener and renewable gases. Palestinians in Gaza should have a say in what is happening to their natural resources, and they should be guaranteed safety. Instead, their communities are being destroyed and violated, and so is their land.
Celine, you were mentioning a little bit about that, and your organization, Slow Factory, has been raising awareness about the interconnected nature of climate justice and other forms of oppression, right?
Absolutely. I mean, connecting the dots is what Slow Factory does in between different issues. For instance, what we're seeing in Atlanta with Cop City, the theft of land, the dispossession of indigenous land in Atlanta to build an entire police academy in the middle of the forest, deforesting in the time of a climate crisis, is completely connected with what we're seeing in Palestine, in Gaza, the deforestation of land and the disposition of land in Gaza and Palestine. It's directly connected. Also, these police officers are trained in Israel. They are shipped from the US to Israel to train in a military format. But I just want to also address that the climate justice movement has ignored Palestine for years. For years, the climate justice movement has not included Palestinian struggle, has not included the Arab struggle, has not even included Arab voices. I mean, Slow Factory was one of the first in the space to really break these boundaries and to say Palestinian lives are part of the global climate crisis movement. Palestinian lives are important, and Palestine is a case study. Lebanon is also a case study when it comes to looking at compounding issues related to war, related to colonialism, the green colonialism that we're talking about, waste colonialism, which we didn't address, which is when foreign countries ship your waste into your country as your country is at war, which is something that Palestine is experiencing, Lebanon has experienced. And so all of these issues are compounding, connecting the dots and drawing the lines between these systems of oppression and exploitation, and being as visible and vocal as possible that Palestine is a human rights issue, it's an environmental issue, it's a feminist issue, it's an indigenous issue. Israeli military forbidding Palestinians to fish, forbidding them to work on their lands, to harvest their crops, while bombing them, bombing the soil with phosphorus gas, rendering the soil poisonous. I mean, all of these are violations of human rights abuse at a scale that is beyond comprehension.
I want to bring back to the issue of this war and the military aspect that has been, I guess, dismissed by many among the climate movement. I mean, one recent study found that militaries account for almost 5.5% of global greenhouse emissions annually. That's more than aviation and shipping industries combined. I mean, Mikaela, why do you think these greenhouse gas emissions that play such a significant role in the climate crisis are largely unaccounted for, especially when we talk about these annual conferences organized by the UN?
Well, I think that has to do with which countries in our geopolitical system have disproportionate power and how they exert that disproportionate power. So, for example, the United States has disproportionate power in our geopolitical system and within the UN and international bodies that have these climate conferences. And as they are the kind of biggest polluter when it comes to war, they're not going to want to include that. It's in a similar way of how the idea of the carbon footprint was popularized by BP, an oil company. And why would they want us to focus on our individual emissions and not look at them? It's because, then we don't look at them and we don't interrogate them. In the same way, if we don't include the emissions from war, if we don't include the emissions from militaries into our climate conferences, then we're going to start talking about loads of other things. We're going to blame it on other issues and not actually ever address the real root cause. And that's why I think that a lot of these big nations have no interest in actually tackling the climate crisis fundamentally. They have no interest in uprooting white supremacy and colonialism. What they want to do is find a way to replicate this same world, but make it green, to greenwash this world and to greenwash the same systems that created it. I think that progressively the people are realizing that that is not possible. We cannot, and also we won't settle for this same world but green. We won't settle for more oppression. We won't settle for ecofascism. We won't settle for continued exploitative capitalism. We want more and we deserve more, but the kind of the ruling classes don't want that, and so that's why they won't include military emissions, because then it shows that maybe we shouldn't be doing this. But not obviously there's the human impact, but the climate impact just makes that argument stronger.
Rania, do you agree? And how do we go about changing that? Is this perhaps a decisive moment to try to put pressure on world leaders and say, hey, we know what's going on and we don't want to replicate this model, as Mikaela just said?
I think a lot of countries, especially when you go to climate conferences like COP, a lot of them try to kind of greenwash their policy. For example, for the Loss and Damage Fund, we have countries like the US who pledged $700 million for the Loss and Damage Fund. And for a lot of people who are not familiar with the way the US spends its money, it might seem like a lot, but however, the US is spending $2 trillion, over $2 trillion on military spending. And I think it's very important for us to push for demilitarization, whether it's as a track for COP conferences or decision-making spaces, because I feel like this is something that a lot of countries don't want because they benefit from war. They benefit from these catastrophes. And we know that the climate justice movement, but also in other injustices around the world, countries are not ready to tackle the catastrophes that generate a lot of funds for them. And I think as activists now, we have to push for demilitarization to be part of the COP agenda, to be part of every decision-making space.
Celine, do you agree? We just have to keep pushing. Is that what activists can do?
Keep pushing, of course, but also defunding in many ways. We have so much more power than we are given credit for. I mean, look at what happened right now with the boycotts on these brands that have made the list of the boycotts and sanction the BDS movement. These brands are being targeted and they are suffering financially. Now, we can do this to a point. I mean, mobilizing, educating oneself, being able to strike, being able to voice our concerns boldly on the internet, in person, with family members. I mean, all of these things are contributing. I mean, we're not seeing them immediately, but we have made a big progress, even in the past 100 days, where Palestine has become a central issue. This has never happened before. I mean, Palestine is the litmus test of every single movement, the climate justice movement, the human rights movement, as I mentioned before. So now talking about Palestine on television, saying free Palestine, wearing T-shirts, talking about it, and also educating one another is also part of it. We must be emboldened. We must not be scared to talk about Palestine and fear for our jobs, fear for our safety because of a big lobby against these human rights values. And furthermore, I want to say that not only defunding, but also mobilizing with our communities, being able to create alternative systems of care, alternative systems of care that are holding us at this time, mutual aid, being able to support one another, transforming this colonial system of segregation and separation, and rebuilding our indigenous communities, our local communities, reconnecting with our roots are also part of the ways in which we are breaking this harmful system.
And that is precisely why we wanted to have you guys here today for this very important conversation and very important suggestions in terms of how we can move forward from here. Thank you all so much, Rania, Mikaela, and